your time. A disclaimer, these artifacts that we are presenting today are either unprovenience, definitely not funerary associated, and they're replicas or reproductions of objects. So if you have any concerns about viewing a reproduction of a associated funerary object, please be mindful that you might see that here today or on Facebook. So, give it away.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Several years ago, I began working on a publication on identifying artifacts. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's published through the IAAA, the Illinois Association for Advancement of Archaeology, which we're a chapter of. This is the Cahokia Archaeological Society. And this went out as a benefit to membership, and we did sell additional copies. Then, several years after that, the Cahokia Mounds Museum Society acquired the rights to reprint it, and they do sell this in the gift shop. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is kind of summarized in the book, all different kinds of artifacts, chipstone, groundstone, pottery, bone, shell, etc. Again, took me several years. I did all the illustrations. There's over 700 of them in here. And so it's one of the few publications that really talks about something besides arrowheads and spear points. And that was always been kind of an interest of mine to try and educate people that there's more than arrowheads. When you ask people, or you tell people you're an archaeologist, they say, you ask them what they think we do. You say, well, you dig up bones and find arrowheads. And actually, we don't dig up bones anymore. Very, very rarely. And but we do find arrowheads, but we find a lot of other things that I'll be talking about tonight as part of this presentation. And I'll be displaying these, and I'll be holding them up, and you can come up here afterwards and take a look at them as well. So I'll start out with what we call chipstone. The primary stone that was used by most Native peoples is what we call chert, or more commonly known as flint. And it has certain properties that allow you to flake it in many different ways to get the shape, the final shape that you want. And the process, and this is just a small thing we would call a core, this is what they start with, sometimes bigger pieces depending on what they're going to make. And they use different kinds of tools to shape that piece of flint by striking it at a certain angle, and that reduces it into the shape that you want. It knocks off flakes, and those flakes are what we call debitage, or waste flakes. So these are pieces that have been knocked off a bigger core. But then you take these flakes, you can utilize them as a cutting tool, or scraping tool, or you can modify them into a more formal shape. So what sometimes we call these utilized flakes, where they're just used in their raw shape. They have very sharp edges and are very, very useful for all different kinds of cutting and scraping. Then you can further reduce those with an antler tool we call a billet. A deer antler or elk antler, and you strike, again, at the very, very edge at a certain angle, and that drives off the smaller flakes. That gives you the kind of edge you want, the shape of the edge. It takes off, if you do it, if you know what you're doing, where there's humps in the flake, like you see here, by hitting it just the right way from both sides. It's called bifacial flaking. You can then produce something that might be recognizable in this case a spear point or a knife. A lot of people call everything that looks like this an arrowhead. That's not an arrowhead, that's too big. An arrowhead is normally about this size. If you have something like this on the end of an arrow, it's too heavy. You don't have the distance or the accuracy you have with a smaller point and a smaller wooden shaft. So, for almost 10,000 years, the Native Americans did not have bows and arrows. They used a device we call an atlatl, a spear thrower, and so this is a reproduction of a spear with a piece of cane, river cane, which used to grow in this area. And it's a favored material for making a lot of spears. And a lot of times they have what we call a foreshaft, to which the spear point would be attached. You throw the spear, you do a deer, then you can pull this out and use that for butchering as a knife. So most of these bigger points have multiple functions as both a spear point and a knife. To propel that spear, they could use something like this called an atlatl. It's like an extension of your arm or another section of arm, so you get a lot more power and thrust when you're throwing the spear. In this case, it has an antler hook at the end. Unfortunately, I picked one that doesn't have a hole. But anyway, that fits into that, and you throw it, you get a lot more power and distance and accuracy than you can with just a regular arm throw. So it was a very effective weapon, but it's an acquired skill to use that. So there's different types of atlatls. This is just one type, and notice there's something, a piece of stone here. We call this a banner stone. When these were first found, people weren't sure what they were used for. They thought they were on the ends of a shaft, like a banner for someone of authority or power. That's where that term comes from. But we know from excavations and various places where they have found evidence of an antler handle sometimes. The wooden shaft is rotted away, then you'll see the banner stone, and then you'll see sometimes an antler tip. But Larry Kinsella, who is an experimental archaeologist, at one time was the atlatl champion of the world when they were having contests and things. He was supposed to do the program tonight, but he's doing a talk at another chapter of our organization.
He's a Tippecanoe guy.
He did the Tippecanoe or Chippecanoe. But anyway, he's experimented with these. He's made banner stones. He's made almost every kind of tool you see up here. He's learned how the natives did it and how they utilized them. And in some of the experiments, there's always been a debate. Some people used to think that you can get a lot more power or distance with the banner stone on there. But what he's found is that if you're out in the woods waiting for a deer to come by and you've got this long spear and the heavy spear point at the end, and you're poised there, after a while, these muscles start to shake and quiver. But if you've got this banner stone back here, it's like a counterbalance against that weight out the front. And he's actually been hooked up to medical instruments. They can measure the stress on the muscles, and this does improve your ability to maintain a sort of a steady hand. But they were also very fancy. Special types of stone were selected by the hunters, the warriors, or whatever they were, and many shapes. Majority of them are kind of butterfly shaped. There's some are more cylindrical. There's about probably 20, 30 different styles of banner stones. This is just one that's called a crescent for obvious reasons. But that's what they used, like I say, for almost 10,000 years before the bow and arrow came in, and that wasn't until probably around 600 or 700 AD that we suddenly stopped seeing these big, heavy, long points. We get those little tiny points. A lot of people call them bird points, and that's kind of a misnomer. They sure they hunt birds with it, but they also hunted bears and deer and elk, people occasionally, and so it's not the size of the point that's important; it's the power behind it. And the bow an arrow is a much more efficient weapon, especially like I say for hunting out in the woods. You can conceal yourself better. You're not having this big motion like you had when you're throwing a spear. With the bow, you can be very quiet and more efficient. So, that being said, and there's different varieties of spear points. Some of the oldest ones are what we call Clovis points, very distinctive leaf shape that has a flute or a flake that's been removed vertically on both sides usually to facilitate make it a better haft with the shaft. And these come in various sizes as well. There's a site near Troy, Illinois, called the Bostrom site, where they found a lot of these, but they're sort of almost like miniature Clovis points. These are what they used when they're hunting the mammoth and the mastodon, giant sloth, short-faced bear, longhorn bison, things like that. So they're often associated with the end of the Ice Age. Most of these would date to about 9,500 BC, 10,000 BC, roughly in that time frame.
Do you want to hold that up over here so I can zoom in on it?
Okay. Then this is followed, this is during what we call the Paleo-Indian period. And we do have an exhibit up here that kind of breaks down the time periods. And I also have handouts up here that describe the different cultural periods and a lot of the typical spear points and arrow points and things. Names that we, as archaeologists, have applied to them. But anyway, this would be that early period. This is a cast of one of the original ones. If you come up a little bit later in time, during what we call the early Archaic, that's when we have a lot of really fancy styles. There's a lot of more variety in shapes. We see more stems, we see notching, and other varieties, especially on the basal part of these points. That's what we look at when we're trying to identify what period it belongs to. Is the shape, the total shape, but also the shape of the base. Because there are only certain styles that were made during certain time periods. This is what we would call a Dalton point. And actually, this is one that Larry Kinsella made. And as you can see, he's very skilled. It's very thin. Some of these do have a small flute or thinning flake removed from the bottom. But these are very typical around 8,500 BC or so. And the one I showed you earlier, this would be kind of that early Archaic period as well. And sometimes this is called a Kirk corner notch. But there's other varieties too. People have different names in different places, different parts of the country for some of these. So these are fairly large. And as we get into the late woodland, or late Archaic period, sometimes we'll get something like these. These are Etley Point and a Wadlow Point. And these are more from the late Archaic times, maybe between 3,000 and 1,000 BC or so. But obviously these are too big to be thrown as a spear, even too big probably to serve well as a knife. So they're probably more of a ritual function to these. We do see similar ones that are smaller, more functional size. But when we see these more enlarged large versions, they were probably used more for display or perhaps as tribute to people when they're buried. But these are casts of ones that were found, I think, in Springfield, Illinois, near where the airport is. These sort of heart-shaped ones here, we call it a Snyder's point. And that's more typical of what we call the middle woodland period, maybe about 2,000 years ago, which would fall into this period in the chart here. But what's interesting also about the woodland period, that's by late woodland, that's when we start seeing the bow and arrow, the small arrow points starting to come in. Also, so we see some of the first pottery being made during that period. Some of the other chipstone items, and these will sometimes be from different cultural periods, but I wanted to make you aware that we do see progression or changes, not necessarily progress, but changes in styles and forms through time. That's kind of displayed in the example up here. Tools like this, here we have a reproduction hafted on a handle to show you how they tied these things to handles to make them more functional. These are adzes, woodworking tools. This is what they would use to make a canoe, dugout canoe, or to shape handles on other tools, or to form wood into other shapes and forms that they needed. They usually have kind of a flat side and a hump side. The flat side would be towards the handle, and usually the broader end is the cutting edge. And after using these for a while, that edge often gets polished or shiny from wear. But also sometimes they would grind that down to make it really smooth and really sharp for sort of more of a refined tool. And adzes come in all different sizes and shapes. Some are quite small, and some are made a little flatter, others are more thick. The thicker ones are more associated with the early archaic, especially the Dalton period. This one like this is probably Mississippian. This is made out of a particular kind of a chert or flint that comes from down in southern Illinois called Mill Creek chert, which is used a lot by the Mississippian people, especially for hoes and other large implements. But those are woodworking tools. And speaking of hoes, some people call this form a spade, but it's kind of a misnomer. When we think about a spade, how we use it today, we tend to think of it, being used in this manner. But the hose, here's a small one, reproduction again, would be attached at right angles, and probably not with a long handle, but you'd be bending over or squatting quite a bit to do the digging. And some of these, I've seen some that are almost 2 feet long, but 12 to 18 inches is about the average size. And again, the majority of these are made out of Mill Creek chert, which kind of ranges in color, as you can see here, from a tan to, or a gray to sort of a tan color. But it occurs in large flat slabs naturally, and it's in the environment down in, again, southern part of Illinois. It's also very hard and very durable chert, and a majority of the hoes we see throughout the Midwest are made from that particular source. But we do see it made from other materials as well. We also see, and this is a tiny one, notched hoes. These again will be tied onto a handle. My feeling is that these bigger ones are more for tilling the soil, breaking up the sod as they're starting to cultivate an area for agriculture. Things like this, this is probably about half the size or a third of the size of most of the notch hoes. I think these were used more for cultivating, for weeding once the crops are up. And this one you can see if you look carefully, you can see it's very shiny on the end. Again, the working in the soil tends to polish the stone. That's how we know they're digging tools, because that's what we call soil polish. And some people believe it's actually an accumulation of materials and minerals that are in the soil that builds up on the stone, and others think it's more of a result of wearing down. So it depends on your point of view. But there have been studies that sort of support both interpretations. But this is a style, again, that's very typical of the Mississippian period, or about 1,000 years ago. Now, let's see. So once they've produced some flakes, they want to make those arrowheads, they want to make knives, and other kinds of tools. Then they do what's called pressure flaking. The earlier style is what we call percussion flaking, where they're actually knocking off big flakes. But then to get the really fine little notches and like the arrowheads and the spear points, they use a variety of materials. Most commonly, the tine or the end of a deer antler. And with that, you would press off very small flakes to get the final shape that you want. We've also occasionally found antler with pieces of copper, and the copper would come mostly from around Lake Superior, and this would be used again for pressure flaking. They have found some of these in some excavations in the Illinois River Valley, still embedded in the antler handle. So we know that they were using it. So a lot of flint knappers today who have relearned all these skills kind of prefer using these, because you can get a lot more control and a better flaking control maybe than you can with the antler. So some of these flakes then will be made into scrapers. There's a couple of examples here, different ways of hafting them. And these will be used for scraping the hides, scraping the hair off the hides, getting the extra meat and tissue off. And it could be used for other types of scraping on handles and things like that too. So wood and hides and other things would be scraped with these kinds of tools. Some of these oftentimes you find what looks like a spear point, but it's got kind of a crescent shape to the end of it. That's usually a spear point that broke, and they rework the edge into a scraper like this. And these were tied on. Well, they would also have a kind of a glue, sometimes made from boiling down deer hooves, or you can use certain kinds of sap and other kinds of combinations of materials to help anchor these in the wooden handles. But also they're tied on with sinew. Sinew is comes from along the backbone and on a part of the legs of the deer. It's actually a tendon, but it's very, very strong, and they would be able to peel this back. You know, it's not as easy as it looks, but you keep peeling and peeling until you get whatever size strands you want. Apply that while it's wet, and as you tie that, and as it dries, it tends to shrink and will help hold the tool to the hafted handle. For bigger tools, they would take the raw hide, cut strips out of it, and again, be applied wet, and when it shrinks, it tends to dry, like in this replicated axe here. Speaking of axes, notice that this is not flint or chert. This is basalt or diorite, sometimes granite. Other hard stones, greenstone, are made into tools by a pecking and grinding process. So this is just a river pebble, a river rock. This is another river rock, but you spend a lot of time, you probably get a lot of tendonitis. But you peck, and each time you peck, it kind of pulverizes the spot where you hit it. And if you do that long enough, you start to produce a shape, make grooves. The older axes, like you see here, are grooved axes. Some of them are what we call 3/4 grooved, and some are full grooved. In other words, the groove goes around only 3 sides, then this side is flat. This one is kind of in between, but the full grooved ones, the groove goes completely around. And that's where they were attached to wooden handles. And quite often what they would do is they would kind of take a piece of wood about this size, and the upper part here they would shave it down so it was thinner, then they could bend that around that groove and bring it down, and then with the rawhide attach it as you see here. And there's other ways they could have done that as well, but that's just one technique, probably the most common technique. Now with the 3/4 groove ones, I think this was an example one here. They also sometimes, the reason it's flat on the bottom there, they drive a wedge in there to help keep it from flexing. And the wood, in this case, the wood is sort of T-shaped rather than going all the way around, but the rawhide does go around. So that's another method of making a more secure axe. So once they had shaped it, they would then grind it on a slab of wet sandstone to get that kind of smooth surface, especially when you're creating the cutting bit. And these things got used over and over again. This one's obviously almost worn out. They've recycled it and reground it several times, so it's still a functional tool, but at one time it was probably maybe an inch or 2 longer than what you see now. A lot of time and a lot of work. Then, that was mostly during the Archaic period. We start, the first axes we see are usually maybe around 5000 BC, up to around 1000 BC. Then we see a new style of axe coming in, the ungrooved axe, or what we call a celt, C-E-L-T. This is an example. So they don't have grooves in them, and the reason they don't, because they have a different kind of handle. Here's one that Larry made. In fact, he's got a whole bunch of them he's made. And he has one that he's cut down over 5,000 trees with over the years and never resharpened it. But these taper, and the hole tapers so it doesn't go all the way through. It wedges, as you use it, it wedges it in there tighter. And again, mostly basalt or diorite, or sometimes granite and other types of similar stone were used to make these celts. And again, these come in various sizes as well. This is probably a more typical size, or somewhere in between these two. But we do see smaller ones as well. Again, pecking and grinding. Notice on this one especially, it's very highly polished. And these are probably more Mississippian. We see these starting to appear at the very end of the Archaic period, but more common through woodland and Mississippian periods. Again, these are time periods that we archaeologists have designed and lump our artifacts and things into those time periods. This is an unfinished tool. This was going to be an adze. Remember, it's flat on one side, kind of humped on the other side, but they are also beginning to peck a groove in it, but the bit has not been completed, so it's not sharp. So this, again, would be tied on to a handle and used in this shape, whereas an axe is parallel to the handle. The adze is at right angles to the handle. So different kind of tool, different function. Let's see. Sometimes they got really fancy with stuff. This is a cast. It's been passed around and used to be in an exhibit, been dropped a few times and glued back together. But the original of this, we call it a spud, was found at the Cahokia site on what we call the Merrill Tract, just to the west of Monk's Mound, and by the farmers who were plowing the fields there. Fortunately, it came up intact. It doesn't very often happen when a field is being plowed. But some people look at these as being a ritual version of an axe. Some have been found associated with handles, or you can see the pecking mark where a handle used to be. But most likely these are more symbols of authority and power. In archaeology, when we're not sure what something is or how it was used, we call it ceremonial. So this is probably more of a ceremonial version of an axe. Again, but probably associated with people in high authority or power within the society. Round objects like this are sometimes called chunky stones or discoidals for the shape. But chunky was a game that was still being played by Indian groups after European contact. So we have some descriptions in early documents of earlier explorers and historians about the game and how it was played. And we see it throughout the Mississippi Valley as far north as the Mandans in North Dakota. And usually, the way the game is described, usually two men will compete on a prepared field. Someone would roll the stone down the field. They would throw their spears or lances to where they anticipated the stone to stop rolling. And if it actually stopped and fell over and touched one of those spears or lances, they got, I guess, bonus points. But it was sort of the national sport for the Mississippians. We see a few of these appearing in the very end of the late woodland period, but they're more distinctive for the Mississippian period. Now there are different styles, and this is about the average size, about 3 or 4 inches in diameter. I've seen some that are, almost 6 or 8 inches. Again, probably ceremonial. But and some that are very small, like children were probably using them as they were learning the game. But and most of them are made out of various types of stone. This one, I'm not positive. I think it's a type of quartzite. A lot of them have been found at Cahokia, were made out of a quartzite that came from southeastern Missouri. But again, sometimes they were selecting color and texture as a component of these, especially those that were probably used in special games. Another brownstone object. This is a sort of a copy of the Birdman tablet that was found at Cahokia. On one side it has the engraved figure of a man with a bird-like mask, a beak, nose, holding the wing up to one side in sort of a dancing posture. And the reverse side has a crosshatch pattern. And the way we interpret this, whether it's accurate or not, it's hard to say. They're representing three different spiritual realms that many Native people believed in. The upper world, represented by the bird, and this is probably the hawk or the falcon being represented here. The man represents this world or the middle world, and the cross-hatching on the back represents snakeskin or associated with the underworld. And so there are certain spiritual forces associated with these different realms, and this is just one way we think they were expressing that. How they use something like this, we don't know. I've been doing a study of tablets from the Mississippian period. I found so far over 30 examples. Most of them are just small pieces or sections of a tablet. This is one of the few that I found intact on the east side of Monk's Mound back in 1971. But some of them have artwork or graphics on them. Almost all of them have some kind of cross-hatching, sometimes on one side, sometimes on both sides. So there's probably some practical function to the cross-hatching. But we don't see a lot of abrasion. So some people thought, well, maybe they're grinding something with it, but they aren't worn down like you would expect if that was the case. Some people thought, well, maybe they're dipping those in pigment and, pressing that on clothing or on bodies to leave those designs. But we don't see much pigmentation in the grooves, if that was the case. So it's kind of a mystery. I'm still trying to figure out just how they're used. But I think those with the graphics on them probably have, again, a more ritual function. One was found at Cahokia, another one besides this one. Back there's actually about half of those that I found were from the Cahokia area. It was found when they were digging for where the museum was built. And it was associated with a sweat lodge. So I was curious, maybe they're using something like that to stimulate the skin or clean it as they sweat in the sweat lodge. But most of these have been found as surface finds, so we don't really know a good context for a lot of them. A lot of times we find rocks with depressions in them like this. A lot of those are actually natural formations where fossils have popped out, or there was maybe a gas bubble when the rock was being formed millions of years ago. But that looks different than something that's man-made. Now some of these we call nutting stones because sometimes the depressions are not quite as deep as what you see here. But they would put a nut in there with another rock. They would, break that open. And sometimes we'll see some of these slabs that have a number of holes. But usually it's usually on a stone like this, about this size. You'll see a shallow depression on both sides. So we think they're using primarily for cracking up open nuts, but also those depressions would form finger grips. So when you're using this as a hammerstone, and a lot of times we see battering along the edges that tells us that was the function of that particular piece. But sometimes also the bottom would be very flat because they used for grinding seeds and grain and other material. So they're kind of multifunctional tools. So they took a naturally shaped rock, modified it, and used it. So an artifact, again, to define it, is something made, used, or modified by humans. Now, we get a lot of people say, they bring in a rock and say, oh, it fits right in my hand. Well, of course, you picked it up, it's in your hand. Then, no, my thumb fits right there, like there's that depression. So these are characteristics of the stone that the Indians were looking for when they were picking something up, something that does fit in their hand and has the right kind of shapes to it. But they're not made in that shape. That's the natural shape that they took advantage of. Let's see what else we got. So going from stone into other materials, mussel shells from the local creeks and streams and lakes not only provided food. Through all these periods, we see evidence of, in the refuse pits, of remnants of the mussel shells. But sometimes they modified these and used them as spoons. Sometimes we found pots with some of these inside them. They often will modify this part of it to shape a spoon. But also they sometimes made tools out of it. Made shell hoes. Knocking a hole in here with a handle is very similar to the kind of handle you would have for a stone notched hoe. They could use this for digging. Now, of course, it's more fragile than stone, so it's probably, again, in cultivated areas that they're utilizing this type of tool. And it only takes a few minutes to make one. It takes a little bit longer to untie it, retie it. It takes a lot longer to make a handle than it does to make most of these tools we've been talking about. Shaping wood is a very tedious and very precise technology. We also find lots of shell beads and seashells, mostly made from the whelk shell, which comes from the Gulf Coast and the Florida coast areas. Tremendous amount of shell made it throughout the rest of the country. That was one of the primary trade items we see through going back into archaic times. What they would do normally is break off the outer whorls of the shell, break those into smaller pieces, drill them, and make shell beads. Most of the shell beads we find are seashell rather than the local mussel shell, which is more fragile, doesn't last as long. They made other kinds of ornaments out of these. As you can see, example here, cutting by scoring it with a piece of flint over and over and over again until you break the piece out. They will often use those to make pendants, what we call gorgets. And oftentimes these have designs or motifs on them. This is another example. And these are actually reproductions of designs that have been found on archaeological specimens. This really fancy one, I think came from the Etowah site. This is a different kind of shell. The fellow who made these as a hobby preferred these because, well, first you can get this type of shell easier, but also it has that sort of mother of pearl look to it. And it was easier to carve than the whelk shell, which is very, very hard. But the spider motif we often see is often associated with women because they were the weavers. And the spider is often associated with that, the weaving. This one has sort of a birdman figure on it. It's got, you can look at this later when you come up, but he's sitting in a sort of almost like a Buddha type position, holding his arms up, has wings, feathers hanging down. He has a deer antler headdress. He has, looks like he's wearing again a mask, but this is based on one that was found archaeologically. Quite often we find ear ornaments as well, mostly made out of shell or sometimes out of limestone. Sometimes the limestone can be very big. You see a lot of kids today with their earlobes stretched with these things, whatever you want to call them, buttons stuck in them. Some of the ear spools we find archaeologically are about this size, and they're again made out of stone. So imagine the weight, how big a hole you had to have in your earlobe. And I guess you start out smaller, and over time they get bigger and bigger as your earlobes stretch. Most of those are more circular or shaped like a pulley, so your ear part would kind of fit like a tire does on a wheel. But there are other ornaments as well. These are some casts of a small, what we call a short-nosed god mask, or masquette. And these have been found sometimes associated with burials. This was a surface find, but this one was actually made out of deer bone. Most of them were very rare. And this is one that Larry Kinsella had, and somebody stole it out of his car. But I think his brother or somebody who was with him was doing some surface collecting and found it. But fortunately, he was able to get it cast before it was stolen. But sometimes we'll find, very rarely, long-nosed god maskettes. Sometimes, again, mostly made out of shell, but there have been a few that have been found made out of copper. In fact, what was called Big Mound in St. Louis, when the mounds were torn down, and that was about 1869, the last one was Big Mound. And apparently there was a burial there, and had these copper maskettes associated with where the ears would be. So these have been found all the way from Florida up into central Illinois and other places in between. Some of the shell ones, the nose was a separate piece, and they had a slit in the back, and they slid the nose through it. Others are carved out of one piece of the shell. You just have to have the right part of the shell. And again, mostly the Buzicon or the whelk shell. They also made other things out of copper. Headdress ornaments, something like you see here. This is a replica. Several of these have been found at other places, but also I think there was one that may have been found at the Powell Mound at Cahokia. But these were probably elements of headdresses. It has kind of a circle, a dotted circle motif in it. Then you get some ceremonial types, axes. We see copper axes going back into the Archaic period. In fact, there's a culture up around the Great Lakes called the Old Copper Complex. And copper, most of the copper we have, what we find, is associated with the source around Lake Superior. And there are several sources up in that area. And some of it is brought down by the glaciers and deposited in Illinois and Indiana and other places too. But what they would do, they didn't have smelting, so they used a process called annealing. They would take those nuggets of copper, heat them in a fire, then beat them with a hammerstone, heat them again, beat them, until they got it flattened out into a shape like you see here. Then they could do some cutting, other shaping to get the final form. And then they beat the edge to get a nice sharp edge to it. This was replicated by one of our former workers at Cahokia, Gene Stratman. And it's based on one that was found at Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma. It's got a handle representing a woodpecker with shell inlays for the eye, and then a native copper for the axe. And after the Archaic period, that Old Copper Complex, when they made all kinds of tools, knives and scrapers and awls and other tools, because it was more common up and around the Great Lakes. But that was mainly Archaic period. But during the Woodland and Mississippian period, copper was sort of like the gold for those people, because they didn't have gold. And it's a shiny metal, when it's sort of symbolic of the sun, so it's often made into ritual items, or again, ceremonial. But so a lot of the ear spools, a lot of times they could beat that copper down to it's like foil and wrap it around like an ear spool or some other type of, sometimes wooden, shaped wooden pieces. So when they were new, they were very bright and shiny. If you find it today, it looks very dark and green from oxidation. But the new ones, newly made pieces, were very bright and shiny. They utilized other minerals. Galena, this is a modern example of a mineral that came from their sources primarily in southeastern Missouri and northwestern Illinois. It's obviously a toxic material, but oftentimes they made a paint out of there. Burn this in a fire, heat it, and crush it, and it produces a white paint, a white pigment. For red, they often used hematite, an iron ore, or more of a clay-like version of that called red ochre, or yellow ochre, depending on where you're finding it. And so those would be sources for pigments. Again, we have to grind this on sandstone, make a powder. Oftentimes we see it was probably used for face and body painting, mixing with water or a clay slurry for making red colors on your pottery and other things like that. They made a lot of tools out of deer bone. Probably the most common types of things are awls or punches. When they're making leather clothing, they're punching the holes in the leather so they can sew the pieces together with sometimes a bone needle and sinew, or sometimes they made thread out of certain plant fibers as well. And others were a little fancier, probably used like hairpins to hold the hair buns together, or maybe even to hold clothing together. And to shape that, they would use something like this, made out of sandstone, just a natural piece of sandstone, and they would grind and grind and grind to get the point, to get it smooth and get it polished. So we find these abraders, a lot of times you'll notice they're used over and over again from all different angles. And the grooves, the longer they're used, the deeper they get. Sometimes they would take pieces of bone and make dice out of them for playing different types of gambling games. Often you would put a number of these marked pieces into a basket or a bowl, and you bang it on the ground, they bounce up, and whichever side faces up has the scoring marks on it. And a lot of wagering involved, a very popular game among both men and women in a lot of the Indian societies. Even today, they're still doing it. A lot of times we find deer toes, bones anyway, phalanges, and some of them have been drilled all the way through, and some of them will have tally marks on them, and we believe that most of these were being used in a sort of a ring and pin type of game. I'm not going to be able to demonstrate this very well, but you would toss that up, and if your bone needle pierced this particular deer toe, you would score the points that are indicated by the marks on it. And again, it was a game that was still being played by a lot of the native peoples throughout America in historic times as well. And we find these in archaeological record as well. And then finally, talking about pottery. We first see pottery showing up in the southeast, in Florida, Georgia area, around 2000 BC or so. But we don't see it in our area until about 600 BC. I don't know why there was that lag in time before it became popular in the Midwest. But before that, the containers were mostly baskets, skin bags, wooden bowls, even stone bowls made out of soapstone, more common in the South. But pottery, you see, initially in Illinois, for instance, it was mostly thick and heavy. Of course, it's made out of clay, and oftentimes they would mix what we call a tempering material with the clay to help hold it together. Because when you're making a pot or mixing clay, when it's wet, you got the shape you want, but as it dries, clay tends to shrink and crack. So they often mixed a tempering material in the clay to keep it from cracking apart like that. And initially, they used what we call grit tempering, which is mostly crushed rock, real fine particles of rock, and also what we call grog, which is they would take old pieces of pottery, break that up, crush it up, and mix it with the clay. So grit and grog were the materials that were initially used throughout most of the woodland period. Toward the end of the woodland and into the Mississippian period, we start to see sometimes limestone being crushed up, especially in this area, but more in the southern part, say from around Dupo or south. The limestone tempering is more common. And in the northern part of the American Bottom area here, we see mussel shell. What they would do is they would take those mussel shells, throw them in a fire, and then after the fire's down, they take those and they would crush them and grind them into a fine, almost powder-like material. And so the shell tempering is often associated mostly with the Mississippian period. So when you see pieces of pottery like this, with these little white flecks in it, that's that crushed up mussel shell. You can see it very clearly on the back side here too. So again, that helps. I've had it explained to me once that sometimes if you have like a glass window and you get a hole in it, it'll tend to start spreading and cracking. And they sometimes would drill a hole through that and put a screw or something in that hole, and that would keep it from going any farther. Well, that's kind of the principle here. You've got enough of this shell in here, probably almost up to half of the volume of the clay, that it really does help keep it together. They made their pottery by taking the clay, mixing it with the tempering material, and while it was wet, they would often roll it like a snake and make a coil. They would coil those rolls of clay on top of each other. Then they would paddle it, sometimes with a wooden paddle, sometimes they could use a stone, sometimes they had a mushroom-shaped tool we called a potter's trowel. That was probably on the inside, so when they shaped the clay or the bowl, it would help reinforce it while they were, and help to blend all those coils together. And the other technique is to take maybe start with a sort of a snake of clay and then flatten it out into a slab, like a large flat ribbon. And for instance, here's an example of a replica of a plate. Probably the rim here was done as a slab. Then you have to weld it together with your fingers and moisture to make sure you don't have any gaps. And you gotta let it dry for a while before you fire it to make it hard. Because if you don't let it dry out, and you've got the little pockets of moisture in there when you put it into a fire, it's like a steam explosion, and it'll pop and crack, and you'll lose parts of it. Some of the earlier pottery, and at the very end of Mississippian also, they did a lot of cord marking. They would take a wooden paddle that had string wrapped around it and paddle that on the outside, again probably with that mushroom-shaped powder straw inside. And that leaves these impressions, which not only has a design effect, but also allows for a better grip when you're holding onto it, but also when you're cooking in a fire, with all that extra surface from all those ridges and valleys, it transfers heat a lot better too. But we see the cord marking coming back at the end of Mississippian. A lot of their pottery was not cord marked, it was smooth like you see here. And sometimes what we call effigy pottery. And this shows a human head here looking inside, and you can hear that. There's actually little pebbles inside. Some of these had rattles in them. This is, again, a replica, but that style, and here's one in the shape of a duck that was found at Cahokia. And again, a replica, but certain animals and people are represented in some of the effigy pottery. Like a duck, for instance, it's a creature that lives in the water, which is associated with the underworld, and it flies in the air, the upper world. So it has these different spiritual connections. A beaver also is one that lives a lot underwater, builds its lodge on the land. So you're traversing different spiritual realms. So creatures that can do that are thought to have special powers. And a lot of times, the duck, for instance, has this sort of a crest-like effect to it. It's probably a wood duck, which also nests in trees. So it's got all these different connections with spiritual realms. This is a bottle. You see the opening at the back of the head. It shows a female in a kneeling position. So probably an older woman. Her vertebrae are shown on the back. Has very skinny arms and prominent collarbones. And we think, in most cases, when we find figurines like this, that's representing the old woman who never dies, or the Earth Mother. And so females in agriculture are often very closely associated, but that's, again, it's part of the cosmology of the people that's being displayed in some of their artwork. Another form of vessel is called a beaker, sort of like shaped like a mug. And some of these do have designs or motifs on them. This is a sort of a copy of one that was found at the Woodhenge area at Cahokia. And it's got the sun symbol. It's got the circle and the cross motif representing the four cardinal directions, the four logs of the sacred fire. It has sun symbolism. There's a outer ring of radiating lines. That's the sun symbol. It's hard to see on this, but there are a couple of avenues that extend through the outer ring of sun rays. And this has been interpreted as being perhaps representing the winter solstice, with the sunrise coming in from the southeast, entering the spiritual world of the world of the earth, then exiting at sunset on the other side. That's, again, open to some conjecture, but obviously we don't know all the answers. I often tell people doing archaeology, we tend to raise more questions than we answer sometimes. And there's other examples of pottery up here. This is a much mishandled piece from our educational closet. It's been made out of, I think, plaster, or it's made out of clay, but it's modern. But it's what we call stumpware. For obvious reasons, it looks like a stump, tree stump. And also, we're kind of stumped sometimes about how they were used. Some folks from the University of Illinois have been doing some studies of these that have been found, and they're mostly associated with kind of the emergent Mississippian or very early Mississippian period. And they look at the residue inside, and they think that what they're doing with these is passing water through lime or limestone to, usually there's a hole, sometimes it comes out the bottom, sometimes out between the legs, sometimes it doesn't come out at all. I'm not sure why, but they think that they're producing a liquid that they soak corn in to make hominy. It breaks down, that lime breaks down the shell of the corn. So it's an intriguing piece. Why they didn't continue making those through later times, we don't know. We do find after this more funnel-shaped pottery, which we think may have had the same kind of function. But not everybody buys that. Some people think that these were what they call fire dogs, put upside down in the fire. Have another one over here. You can set your pot on top of that to cook with, or when you're making a pot. So it's another interpretation. So we're still trying to figure some of these things out. A lot of things don't survive in the archaeological record, especially in the Midwest, because of the moisture in the soil, the acidity in the soils. So a lot, I showed you a lot of handles and wood things here. About the only time in the Midwest where we find something like that is in a dry cave, where it hasn't been subject to, a lot of rain and soaking. But we know they were using gourds as containers, as dippers. Clothing doesn't survive except very rarely, unless it's been charred in a fire, carbonized. Sometimes we'll find fragments of cloth, fragments of wood, fragments of boards, things like that that have been charred in a fire. So what I'm showing you here is mostly the hard stuff that survives, not every kind of thing they had. But it gives you an idea of the variety of materials and what it takes to make some of these things. So that's kind of a conclusion to my presentation. I'd be glad to try and answer any questions you might have. Yes?
I don't see any beads. Larry had me showing kids how to drill holes in shell.
Well, that's going to be a program that Larry's going to do on bead making and shell work. But yeah, a lot of little tiny things we call micro drills, and I don't think I have an example here. No. But they're little tiny slivers of flint that have been intentionally shaped and would be inserted into the end of a piece of cane, and then using your hand to spin that cane shaft, it would drill a hole in the pieces of shell. And it takes a long time to drill a hole, at least half an hour to 45 minutes to get a hole through a piece of shell about this size. But when you consider how many thousands and thousands and thousands of shell beads have been found just at Cahokia, not to mention all the other Mississippian world and going back in earlier periods, the trade in marine shell must have been very extensive over long periods of time. We don't think it's being used as money, but it has value. So, a few beads might be worth a deer hide. There was a bartering system that was probably more in operation than a monetary system. Yes?
Can you tell me what period the atlatl was used?
There's some debate about when the atlatl was first used. They found examples of it in Europe and I think Eurasia. That goes back maybe 20,000 years. But we think that the people who first made it to America were probably, at least some of them were using the atlatl during what we call the Paleo period. But we were pretty definite that they had it by archaic times. But, and there's been a debate among some of our colleagues about just when it first appeared. But we know there is a longer ancient history of it in the old world. Yes.
Bill, you want to show, maybe people come up and see the things as we're
All
going?
right.
Time limit?
Yeah, we've got 15 minutes.
I've got to pack things up pretty
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah, so let's-
Katie has a question.
I was just wondering, I always think of Indians as foragers. When did they start farming?
We see the beginnings of agriculture during late Archaic, about 3,000 BC. Squash and sunflowers were some of the first things. Then later, a lot of seed-bearing plants. Corn didn't really become a popular food item until after 900 AD. So, you know, much later time.
Well, while we have a hands-on to show people, because we probably got to get, is it 8 o'clock?
Well, I know.
We have to get out at 8, she just
I've got to
announced.
pack all this stuff up too.
I know, so that's-
Come on up.
We have to pack it up.
Anybody wants to see anything?
And there are, again, the handouts here and on the front table, examples of our newsletter that the IAAA produces. If you get as a benefit of membership, if you aren't a member. And when we produce these journals about every 3 or 4 years, that's a benefit of membership as well.
So are all of those mostly reproductions?
Most of these are reproductions. Most of the actions are real.
No, that, he was no last one.
The big hoe is real.
How do you not get them mixed up?
We know what to look for.
Yeah.
What's the next mark?
Remember,
What's the next mark?
I knew you had to wrap it.
second Tuesday,
Second.
second Tuesday of the month, next month, second Tuesday,
You're going to Irish.
Ravenelli's,
Yeah.
11 a.m., 11 a.m.
I know.
We start, no,
Pull things that are
we used to
mine.
start about 11:30, 12. The new president says,
No, I got the word on it. Yeah.
the new president,
I knew it was 11.
I was like, I don't remember seeing that.
they have a coffee,
These are mine.
they have these books at the library.